The courtroom buzzed with tension. It was one of those high-stakes civil cases that everyone in town was talking about. At the center of the storm sat Victor Grant, a powerful corporate lawyer known for steamrolling anyone who dared challenge him. Arrogant and smug, Victor never lost. And today, he wasn't worried. Across from him, standing behind the plaintiff's table, was a teenage girl, maybe 19 or 20, her posture firm but calm, her eyes sharp with purpose. She wore a crisp suit, minimal makeup, and had her thick curls tied back in a no-nonsense bun. No one in the room could quite figure out who she was. Victor leaned over, smirking as he whispered to his client, "They sent a student intern to argue this? I almost feel bad." The girl didn't flinch. As the judge entered and everyone rose, Victor glanced at her again, amused. She was so young. What could she possibly know about law? The trial began, and as introductions were made, the judge raised an eyebrow when the girl stood. "I will be representing the plaintiff today. My name is Eliana James." Victor burst out laughing, not a chuckle, a full laugh that echoed through the courtroom. "You're just a kid," he scoffed loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This'll be over in 10 minutes. Eliana simply looked at him. And then, with a chilling calm, she replied, "I suggest you sit tight, Mr. Grant. In 20 minutes, you'll be drafting your own resignation letter." The room fell silent. Victor's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly waved it off. "Confidence is cute," he muttered, flipping open his binder with a dramatic flair. "Let's get this over with." But Eliana didn't flinch. She didn't stammer or second-guess herself. Instead, she stepped forward, placed a thick, tabbed folder on the table, and began speaking with measured, razor-sharp clarity. "Your Honor, today we will present conclusive evidence that Mr. Grant's client engaged in a coordinated effort to silence whistleblowers within their company, leading to financial fraud, wrongful terminations, and violations of multiple federal regulations." Victor scoffed again. Allegations without proof. Eliana didn't look at him. Instead, she lifted a USB stick and handed it to the clerk. "Exhibit A, Your Honor. Internal emails, unredacted, between Mr. Grant's client and senior executives. They outline a plan to falsify audit records and intimidate employees who spoke out. These were obtained legally through discovery. Verified by metadata." The judge blinked, brows raising. Victor sat forward, suddenly less relaxed. The emails loaded on the screen. There, in plain view, was a message with Victor CC'd in the chain, laughing at an employee who was fired after reporting safety violations. Victor's smile vanished. Eliana continued, her voice steady. "There's more. Including video footage from inside the office, deposition testimony from 2 former employees, and financial reports that contradict the public statements made by the company, statements Mr. Grant personally signed off on." Victor's jaw clenched. His client leaned over, whispering frantically. Eliana didn't stop. "And to be clear, if the court permits, we'll be turning over the full contents to federal investigators after today's proceedings." For the first time in his long career, Victor was speechless. Because the kid wasn't bluffing. She had come prepared, not to argue, but to end him. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The courtroom, which had once buzzed with murmurs of skepticism about the kid attorney, now simmered with a different kind of tension, quiet disbelief that someone so young had come armed with a legal arsenal. Judge Monroe leaned forward. "Ms. James, do you have corroborating testimony for these claims?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eliana replied without hesitation. "We have 3 sworn depositions. 2 from former employees who were terminated after raising internal concerns, and 1 from a third-party auditor who was pressured to alter financial reports. I've submitted full transcripts, along with a notarized timeline that maps the chain of misconduct." Victor's hands twitched as he shuffled his papers, hoping to find some gap, some oversight, something to punch back with. Instead, he found nothing. His client, red-faced and sweating, hissed under his breath, "You said this was handled. You said she was bluffing." Eliana, still calm, stepped forward again. "And just for the record," she said, locking eyes with Victor, "we are not seeking a settlement. We're seeking accountability." Victor finally stood, a hint of panic creeping into his voice. "Objection, this is posturing. She's trying to sway the court with emotion and spectacle." But the judge didn't seem convinced. In fact, Judge Monroe stared at him with growing concern. "Mr. Grant, are you disputing the authenticity of these documents?" Victor opened his mouth. Closed it. He looked around the courtroom, hearing whispers now, seeing the bailiff shift uncomfortably. Journalists in the back row were already scribbling. A camera crew outside the building would be waiting for the break. Eliana turned back to the judge. "With your permission, I'd like to call our first witness to the stand, Mr. Darren Locke, former Director of Internal Compliance." The side door opened. A man in a suit walked in slowly, older, with tired eyes and a firm step. Victor's face turned pale. Because Darren Locke wasn't just a disgruntled employee. He was the man Victor personally threatened 2 years ago to keep quiet. And now, he was walking straight into the courtroom, ready to talk. Darren Locke took the stand, adjusted the microphone, and glanced briefly at Victor before focusing on the judge. "Please state your name and former position for the record," Eliana requested. "Darren Locke. I was the Director of Internal Compliance at Crestmont Technologies for 8 years. And why did you leave the company, Mr. Locke?" He exhaled slowly. "Because I refused to falsify audit findings. I reported safety violations and financial discrepancies. A week later, I was forced to resign under pressure." Victor shot to his feet. "Objection, he was terminated for violating protocol, not overruled," Judge Monroe said sharply. "You'll have your chance to cross-examine, Mr. Grant. Sit down." Victor obeyed, jaw clenched. Eliana nodded and turned back to the witness. "Mr. Locke, did anyone within the company, or representing the company, attempt to silence you?" "Yes," he said. "2 executives met with me off the record. They said if I stayed quiet, they'd ensure I received a generous severance and a clean reference. If not," he paused. "They mentioned legal consequences. They said, and I quote, 'We have lawyers who know how to bury problems.'" One of them referenced Mr. Grant by name. Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Victor's face reddened, but Eliana was relentless. "And did you document this interaction?" Darren reached into a folder and held up a printed transcript. "I recorded the conversation. It's all here. The original file is on the flash drive submitted as Exhibit B." Judge Monroe turned to the clerk. "Verify the contents." Victor leaned forward again, whispering aggressively to his client. "Why wasn't this scrubbed?" The client shot back, "You told me it was handled. You swore no one had anything." Eliana waited patiently as the judge scanned the transcript, his expression shifting from neutral to grim. When he looked up, his voice was steady. "This court will recess for 10 minutes while I review the remainder of these exhibits. But let me be clear, the allegations presented are not only serious, they border on criminal misconduct. Mr. Grant, you may want to contact counsel of your own." Victor didn't respond. Because for the first time in his career, he wasn't the one in control. And Eliana James, the kid he mocked just minutes ago, had flipped the entire courtroom upside down. The gavel echoed as Judge Monroe stood and exited the courtroom. The tension lingered, thick and electric. Victor sat frozen. His client had gone pale, practically shrinking into his chair. The murmurs from the gallery were no longer whispers, they were buzzing commentary. A few journalists had already stepped out, no doubt to break the story before the recess ended. Across the aisle, Eliana calmly gathered her documents, her expression unreadable. But inside, she could feel the weight of the moment. Not for pride. Not even for victory. But because justice was finally catching up. Victor turned, his voice low but desperate. This isn't over. You think one witness and a USB stick will ruin me? Eliana glanced over with that same unsettling composure. I don't think it, she said. I know it. He scoffed again, though it lacked the conviction of earlier. You're what? 20. You don't understand the game you're playing. Maybe not your version of it, she replied. But I understand the law. And I understand truth. And neither of them is on your side. Victor shook his head, standing and walking toward the hallway, needing air, or a miracle. He pulled out his phone, dialing someone frantically. Eliana watched him disappear, then turned to her mentor, seated quietly a few rows behind. Judge Carolyn Wyatt, retired now, nodded once with approval. You were right, Eliana whispered. He underestimated me. Men like him always do, Wyatt replied. That's what makes them vulnerable. Back inside the recessing courtroom, the clerk approached Eliana. Judge Monroe asked for copies of all remaining exhibits. He's requesting your timeline and phone records next. Eliana handed them over without hesitation. They're indexed and time-stamped. Nothing redacted. Victor re-entered moments later, rattled but trying to reassemble his mask. But the eyes around the courtroom no longer saw a dominant attorney. They saw a cornered man. Because the trial was no longer just about corporate misconduct. It was about a reckoning. And Eliana James had just put a career predator in her sights, with the law as her weapon. When the courtroom reconvened, the energy had shifted completely. Victor returned to his seat with forced composure, though the beads of sweat forming on his temple betrayed his nerves. He tapped his pen rapidly against the table, eyes darting toward the judge's bench. Eliana stood poised, her demeanor unchanged, like a calm before a storm that she controlled entirely. Judge Monroe entered and sat with a stern face. I've reviewed the submitted exhibits, including the audio files, financial reports, and testimony transcripts, he said. This court finds the evidence credible, admissible, and deeply troubling. Victor didn't blink. His jaw was tight. Ms. James, the judge continued, you may proceed with your next witness. Yes, Your Honor, Eliana replied. The plaintiff calls Ms. Jenna Ryland, former financial controller for Crestmont Technologies. A woman in her late 30s stepped into the courtroom. Neatly dressed, steady gaze. She walked straight past Victor without acknowledgement. He refused to meet her eyes. Eliana began, Ms. Ryland, in your time at Crestmont, were you ever instructed to manipulate financial statements? Yes, she said plainly. Quarterly reports were regularly inflated before board meetings. When I refused to alter the fiscal summary in Q3, I was told to cooperate or disappear. Who told you that? An executive. But the language, the pressure, it all came from higher up. Mr. Grant was involved in reviewing those reports before they were made public. Victor stood. Objection, conjecture. But Eliana was ready. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C, a signed memo from Mr. Grant with direct revisions made to the very summary in question. The metadata confirms the edit date. It aligns with Ms. Ryland's testimony. The clerk handed the document to the judge. Victor slowly sank back into his seat. Eliana pressed forward. And what happened after you refused to comply, Ms. Ryland? I was put on indefinite leave. Then terminated. No explanation. Just a non-disclosure agreement and a threat of legal action if I spoke out. Victor's face was a mixture of disbelief and silent fury. He hadn't prepared for this level of documentation. He certainly hadn't expected it from someone he dismissed with a smirk and a comment about her age. Now it was Eliana who stood tall, owning the space he once dominated. Jenna Ryland looked over at her briefly and smiled, a small gesture of gratitude. Eliana nodded once in return. Because what she had started wasn't just about holding one man accountable. It was about dismantling the idea that power makes a person untouchable. And piece by piece, she was taking it all away from him. Victor no longer looked like the high-powered attorney he once was. His blazer hung awkwardly on his frame, as if even his suit had given up on him. His usual arrogance had drained into a silent stare, cold, disconnected, and increasingly vacant. But Eliana wasn't done. "Your Honor," she said, "our next witness was originally reluctant to testify. But upon learning of the protections provided by this court, he agreed. I'd like to call Mr. Kevin Arlo, former junior legal associate at Grant Pierce LLP." There was an audible shift in the room. Victor's head snapped toward the back doors as Kevin entered. The young man looked nervous, but determined, someone who had once admired Victor, maybe even tried to emulate him. Now, he was here to tell the truth. After being sworn in, Eliana began gently. "Mr. Arlo, how long did you work under Mr. Grant?" 3 years. "And in that time, did you witness anything inappropriate or unethical in regard to how client cases were handled?" Kevin swallowed hard. "Yes. There were meetings, off the record, where we discussed how to stall whistleblower complaints, bury evidence during discovery, and exploit procedural loopholes to exhaust opposition." Victor's face hardened. "That's a lie, he's a disgruntled dropout." Kevin didn't flinch. "I left because I couldn't live with what we were doing. I took copies of memos, emails, and even internal strategy notes, most of which were deleted from the firm's database." Eliana nodded. "Do you have these materials with you?" Kevin reached into his bag and pulled out a thick file, then passed it to the bailiff. "Eliana has them all, but I wanted to give them directly to the court. So there's no doubt where they came from." Judge Monroe flipped through the first few pages, eyes narrowing. He looked up. "Mr. Grant, would you like to respond?" Victor's voice cracked slightly. "These are stolen documents, he had no right to take them." "Actually," Eliana cut in smoothly, "Mr. Arlo legally preserved these documents after being instructed to delete them, an action which would have violated state and federal law. His preservation of evidence falls under whistleblower protections." The judge raised a brow. "And it appears that deletion would have indeed obstructed justice." Victor leaned back, fists clenched under the table. His client was gone, having slipped out during the last break, likely making his own calls to crisis management teams. Now, Victor was alone. No backup. No leverage. And the courtroom, the place where he used to dominate, had turned against him. Eliana turned toward him for the first time in a while. Not with spite. Not with glee. But with resolve. "You told me I was just a kid," she said, voice low but piercing. "But I built this case, piece by piece, while you dismissed every warning sign. You weren't paying attention. And now," she paused, eyes locked on him. "Everything's unraveling right where you thought you were safest." The room was still. Victor stared straight ahead, barely blinking. It wasn't just the case he was losing, it was his identity, his reputation, his carefully crafted empire built on intimidation and manipulation. And Eliana was far from finished. "Your Honor," she said, "with the court's permission, I'd like to submit a final piece of evidence, Exhibit D." She walked to the clerk and handed over a single envelope. Judge Monroe opened it, unfolding the contents carefully. "This," Eliana said, her voice steady and deliberate, "is a signed affidavit from a former paralegal who worked on over a dozen of Mr. Grant's past cases. In it, she outlines a deliberate pattern of evidence suppression, witness tampering, and coercive settlement tactics, stretching back nearly a decade." The judge's face darkened as he scanned the affidavit. Victor's hand went to his tie, loosening it slightly as the walls seemed to press in around him. The affidavit includes dates, names, and even references to cases previously dismissed under suspicious circumstances. Some of those cases were quietly reopened during this investigation. A pause. And investigators have already contacted the individuals named. Several have agreed to testify in federal proceedings. Victor finally stood, his voice desperate. This is a coordinated hit job. She's using disgruntled ex-employees and twisting events to destroy my career. Judge Monroe's gavel slammed once. Enough, Mr. Grant. Victor went silent. The sound echoed like a final nail in a coffin. This court has seen overwhelming preliminary evidence of unethical conduct, not just from your client, but from you, personally. The pattern is clear. The court will recommend a formal review by the State Bar Association and submit all evidence to the relevant authorities. Victor sat back down slowly, his shoulders sagging. From the gallery, gasps and murmurs swelled. One reporter quietly exited to call their editor. Eliana turned toward the judge one last time. Your Honor, my client thanks the court for hearing the truth, and for showing that no one is above the law, no matter how powerful they believe they are. Judge Monroe gave a small nod. This court commends your preparedness, Ms. James. You've demonstrated poise, professionalism, and a level of skill far beyond your years. Victor looked over at her, broken, not by shouting, not by vengeance, but by a single, chilling realization: she hadn't just won the case. She had ended his career. And all she needed was the truth, and one brutal sentence. The courtroom emptied slowly, whispers trailing behind every step. Victor sat motionless, staring blankly at the papers on the table. His empire, his legacy, everything he had clawed for over decades, was crumbling before his eyes. Eliana packed up her files with calm precision, ignoring the lingering stares of disbelief and admiration. As the judge prepared to leave, he stopped and looked back. Ms. James, you may be young, but today you reminded us all that true power lies in integrity and preparation. I expect to hear great things from you in the future. Eliana nodded, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed her. Ms. James, how did you build such a strong case against one of the most feared lawyers in the city? She paused thoughtfully. I did my homework. I listened to those who were silenced, and I didn't let my age or others' doubt stop me. Sometimes, all it takes is the courage to speak the truth, no matter who's listening. A cameraman caught her final words on tape. Back inside, Victor sat alone in his office for the last time, staring at a resignation letter he hadn't yet sent. The sentence echoed in his mind, the one that had shattered his facade: I suggest you sit tight, Mr. Grant. In 20 minutes, you'll be drafting your own resignation letter. And now, it was real,